Welcome to the historic blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe. Not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. Now let's begin with Story 1, the East India Company and the Quiet Foundations of Empire. You may think of empire as a matter of conquest and battlefields, but in truth, the foundations of the British Empire in the East were laid quietly through ledgers, treaties, shipments, and silence. It began not with armies but with accountants, and not with a crown but with a charter. It's the year 1600. Queen Elizabeth I, reigning over a small but increasingly ambitious island nation, grants a royal charter to a group of London merchants. This charter, formerly known as the Governor and Company of Merchants of London trading into the East Indies, would later be shortened to a name much more familiar, the East India Company. At first, it is simply a business concerned with spices, textiles, and tea. The men who operated it were not conquerors but clerks, secretaries, and investors. They tracked ships, prices, and profits. Their empire grew not through warfare, but through trade slowly, incrementally, and almost boringly. By the early 1700s, the company had established small factories, trading posts along the Indian coastline. These outposts, in places like Surat, Bombay, Madras, and Calcutta, were fortified not for battle, but to keep out rivals. The Dutch, French, and Portuguese also vied for Indian trade, and the British were just one among many suitors. Life in these coastal enclaves was tedious and bureaucratic. Letters home from company servants often complained not of violence but of monotony. They described long, humid nights filled with paperwork, slow correspondence with London, and endless inventories of silk, indigo, and saltpeter. Calcutta, established in 1690 by Job Charnock, a company agent, became the administrative heart of British Bengal. It wasn't a glamorous place. The early buildings were wooden, prone to fire, and constantly under repair. Disease was rampant, especially malaria, and many British officers died before they ever completed a year of service. Yet behind this backdrop of tedium, something more profound was happening, the slow assumption of sovereignty. The Mughal Empire, once dominant in India, was fragmenting. Local rulers known as Nawabs were asserting greater independence. Into this power vacuum, the company quietly stepped. They began signing treaties, often written in Persian and translated with difficulty. These documents were dense with legalese, and yet their consequences were immense. The company secured the right to collect taxes in Bengal not directly at first, but through diwani, or revenue farming. Clerks began taking on the functions of rulers. One of the most quietly significant shifts occurred in 1765, when the Mughal Emperor Shah Alam II, weakened and dependent on British protection, granted the East India Company the right to collect revenue from Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. There were no parades, no cannons fired, just ink, paper, and a seal. In Whitehall, few people paid attention. This was still nominally a private company. The British government had little interest in day-to-day Indian administration, but slowly something was changing. Company men were no longer just traders, they were magistrates, revenue collectors, and judges. They didn't always understand the systems they inherited. The Indian land revenue structure was complex, with local landlords, zamindars, sharecroppers, and village councils. But company officials, often young men fresh out of England, attempted to codify and regulate everything. They created maps, registers, and assessments trying to turn an organic system into one that could be filed away in London. By the end of the 18th century, the company had become a kind of state. It maintained its own army sepoys, mostly Indian soldiers led by British officers. It minted its own coins. It administered laws and maintained jails. And yet, it was still technically a business. This paradox of a trading company governing millions was not lost on its employees. Some embraced it, seeing themselves as civilizing agents. Others resisted, longing for the days when they only had to worry about cargo manifests and shipping timetables. But for the Indian people, the shift was real and visible. Local rulers were now answerable to men with ledgers. Land was remeasured, reassigned, and resettled. In Bengal, the introduction of permanent settlement in 1793 fixed land revenue rates in perpetuity, a policy intended to encourage investment, but which led to widespread hardship and dispossession among peasants. In London, debates began to stir. Should a company rule a country? What responsibilities came with such power? Evangelicals pushed for moral reform. Economists questioned the monopolies the company enjoyed. Parliament began to take notice slowly through acts like the Regulating Act of 1773 and the Pitt's India Act of 1784, asserting more oversight. Still, in the outposts of empire, daily life remained the same. Early risings, correspondence, audits, and reports. British officials recorded rainfall, crop yields, and local disputes with the same attention they gave to spice prices. It was history made not in the blaze of battle, but in the margins of account books. As the 19th century dawned, the East India Company stood at an inflection point. It had become a reluctant ruler, with vast territory under its control. But cracks were beginning to show not only in its moral and economic foundation, but in its ability to keep peace. The seeds of discontent were being sown among soldiers, among zamindars, among merchants and peasants alike. They would not bear fruit just yet, but the soil had been prepared. How long, one wonders, could an empire built on paper, coin, and silence truly endure? By the early decades of the 19th century, the East India Company's transformation was all but complete. It no longer merely represented the interests of British merchants in the East, it now functioned as a governmental machine, its gears lubricated not by royal edicts or popular support, but by paperwork, survey instruments, court systems, and coinage. From Calcutta to Madras, the old coastal trading posts had grown into seats of administration. The machinery of rule slowly assembled during the 18th century was being formalized, standardized, and expanded. For the clerks, magistrates, and surveyors now flowing into India from Britain, their work was not dramatic. It was, more often than not, painfully slow. The roads into the Indian interior were still primitive in many regions. Horses gave way to elephants, carts to canoes, but maps were being drawn with greater precision. James Rennell, often referred to as the father of Indian geography, had begun this task in the late 18th century, and his successors carried the work forward with relentless detail. Rivers were charted, elevations recorded, villages counted, not for glory but for taxation. The empire was becoming visible on paper. And so too were its subjects. In 1803, following the Second Anglo-Maratha War, the company added Delhi, once the symbolic seat of the Mughal Empire, to its domain. The company had not deposed a king through a great revolution, but rather through a combination of diplomacy, trade alliances, and calculated military interventions. Control passed, not through a coronation, but via memorandums and signatures. Delhi's Mughal ruler remained a figurehead. Real authority rested with company administrators, many of whom had never set foot in Britain, having been born in India, trained within the company's own networks, and steeped in its bureaucratic ethos. This class of administrators became known as the company men. Their training was rooted in rules. The East India College at Haileybury, established in 1806, was not a place of military drills or martial valor. Instead, it offered instruction in Persian, Arabic, Sanskrit, Indian law and revenue collection. The goal was to produce gentlemen who could understand and regulate. One of the most important of these men was Thomas Munro, who would become governor of Madras. A soldier by training but a reformer by inclination, Munro believed in what he termed village republics, the idea that Indian villages were largely self-sufficient and that good governance required minimal interference. Yet even this philosophy required measurement, documentation, and oversight. Ironically, Munro's attempts at non-intervention resulted in thousands of pages of survey reports. As the company pushed further inland, they brought with them not only ledgers but laws. British legal reformers in India faced a conundrum: how to govern a vast and diverse population without appearing to destroy its customs. The solution was codification. The Indian Penal Code, begun in the 1830s by Thomas Babington Macaulay, aimed to systematize law across British India. It was modeled on utilitarian principles and intended to be impartial and secular. But it brought with it an avalanche of regulations, legal categories, and new interpretations of justice. Crimes that had once been mediated by village elders or caste councils were now subject to judges, clerks, and appeals. This legal revolution did not sweep through India like wildfire. It moved case by case, filing cabinet by filing cabinet. Yet the effect was profound. Justice was no longer local, it was institutional, procedural, and recorded. Another tool of unification was currency. In 1835, the East India Company introduced a unified silver rupee, replacing the patchwork of coins in circulation. The obverse bore the image of King William IV, later replaced by Queen Victoria. The coins were more than just economic instruments, they were symbols of sovereignty. With each transaction, the British state, through its corporate proxy, became more present in daily life. Then came education. In 1835, the same year the silver rupee was minted, Macaulay delivered his now infamous minute on Indian education. In it, he argued for the promotion of English over Persian or Sanskrit, reasoning that British literature and science were superior and should form the foundation of elite education in India. His goal was to create, as he put it, a class of persons, Indian in blood and color but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellect. It was a cold, calculated approach to cultural influence, and it worked in part. By mid-century, Anglo-Indian schools began producing clerks, translators, and administrators who formed a small but influential middle class. These were the men who filled the lower rungs of the bureaucratic ladder, and they were taught to respect rules, documentation, and British rationality, even as they increasingly questioned the authority behind them. Yet even as the machinery of governance advanced, the human cost often went unrecorded. In the countryside, peasants were being pressured to grow cash crops like indigo and opium, often at the expense of food crops. These demands, tied to export markets and company profits, made rural India vulnerable to famine and debt. Zamindars, often favored by the British, collected taxes with increasing harshness, while company officials rarely intervened unless the revenue declined. One of the most profitable ventures was the opium trade. Grown in eastern India under a strict monopoly, opium was processed in massive company-run factories and then sold to Chinese merchants. The British government in London disapproved of this commerce, at least publicly, but the company persisted. When China resisted, Britain would respond, but that is a story for another time. For now, we return to the sepoys, Indian soldiers serving under British command. By the 1840s, the East India Company maintained one of the largest standing armies in the world, with over 200,000 Indian soldiers. They wore uniforms, followed drills, and were bound by loyalty and pay. But the divide between Indian sepoys and British officers was rigid. Promotions were rare for Indians. Pay was low, and cultural friction was constant. Sepoys were drawn from diverse backgrounds: Hindu, Muslim, Sikh and their service was bound by both honor and necessity. Some joined for income, others for status. But tensions simmered below the surface. Orders that interfered with religious customs, long marches into foreign lands, or delayed payments could all stoke dissatisfaction. Company officials, immersed in reports and protocols, often failed to read the mood. The warning signs were there in petitions, in quiet protests, in lowered morale. But the belief in order, in paperwork, in precedent, kept the machinery running. Then, in 1856, the British passed the General Service Enlistment Act, which required Indian soldiers to serve overseas if ordered, a violation of many Hindu customs. It was one among several triggers. The following year, the long-standing control the East India Company had exerted over India, so slowly built, so bureaucratically maintained, would come under sudden, violent challenge. The machinery of empire had become too rigid, too alienated from the people it governed. Its silence, once its strength, would now become its flaw. But before the storm breaks, one must wonder, how did a company of merchants, obsessed with balance sheets and seals, fail to notice the cracks in its foundation? It began, like many of history's most transformative events, not with a declaration but with a cartridge. In early 1857, sepoys in the British East India Company's Bengal Army were issued new Enfield rifles. These rifles required soldiers to bite open greased paper cartridges to load gunpowder. Rumors spread quickly that the grease was made from cow and pig fat, sacrilegious to both Hindu and Muslim soldiers. The cartridge, a seemingly small detail, lit the fuse on a century of growing resentment. For years, the East India Company had ruled through a veneer of legality and tradition. It upheld local customs where convenient, restructured them where profitable, and reinterpreted them when needed. Its control relied not only on soldiers and clerks, but on the assumption of obedience. When obedience wavered, the company, for all its ledgers and laws, found itself unprepared. The mutiny began in Meerut on May 10, 1857. Indian soldiers, imprisoned for refusing the cartridges, broke out of jail and attacked British officers. They then marched to Delhi, declaring allegiance to the aging Bahadur Shah Zafar, the last symbolic Mughal emperor. It was a move filled with irony. The same company that had eroded the Mughals' power now saw its own authority challenged in their name. What followed was a series of uprisings across northern India in Kanpur, Lucknow, Jhansi, and elsewhere. But these were not uniform. Some were coordinated, others spontaneous. Some had political aims, others were driven by local grievances. While the British called it the Sepoy Mutiny, Indian historians have described it as the first war of independence, though it lacked national unity or central leadership. Still, what united many rebels was resentment not just of British rule, but of the company's administration. In towns and villages, memories were long. There was the land settlement system that had bankrupted smallholders, the court systems that replaced local mediation with distant judges, the education policies that ignored traditional knowledge, and always the taxation relentlessly calculated, collected, and enforced. The company responded with force. British troops, along with loyal Indian soldiers including Sikhs and Gurkhas, fought back town by town, street by street. The conflict was brutal and marked by atrocities on both sides. Mass executions, reprisals, and massacres became common. British retribution in Delhi and Kanpur was especially severe, aimed not only at punishing rebels, but at extinguishing the very idea of resistance. But beneath the violence was something else: administrative confusion. The East India Company, despite its vast bureaucracy, found itself unable to adapt quickly. Communication between distant provinces was slow. Decision-making was bottlenecked in Calcutta and London. Governors hesitated, unsure whether to enforce martial law or preserve civil order. Reports took weeks to reach the Board of Control in Britain. The machine had never been built for war, it had been built for profit and process. By mid-1858, the rebellion had been largely suppressed. British reinforcements had arrived. Rebel leaders were executed or exiled. Bahadur Shah Zafar was tried and sent to Burma, a poetic end for a man who had once ruled from the Red Fort. But victory brought no celebration. Instead, it prompted an inquest into failure. In London, public opinion turned sharply against the East India Company. The old question, should a corporation rule a subcontinent, now demanded an answer. The answer came swiftly. In August 1858, the Government of India Act was passed. The East India Company was abolished. Its functions were transferred directly to the British Crown. Queen Victoria became the Empress of India. A new office, the Secretary of State for India, was created, and the Indian civil service, once the preserve of company men, was open to competitive examination, albeit largely inaccessible to Indians at the time. The change was formal, not revolutionary. Many of the same administrators remained in place. The court systems, taxation structures, and educational reforms continued, but the fiction of corporate rule was gone. A new era had begun, one of direct imperial governance. And what of the company's legacy? Its archives were immense. Millions of pages of reports, letters, court cases, treaties, and survey maps. These documents now formed the skeleton of colonial rule. The British Raj, born in 1858, would rely heavily on the paper trails left behind. The East India Company had achieved what no corporation before or since has accomplished: the governance of an entire nation. But it had done so without a true understanding of that nation's soul. It had built a state of surveys and settlements, and in doing so, it had alienated the very people it governed. Even its own employees had grown disillusioned. By the 1850s, few company men romanticized their roles. Letters from officers speak of exhaustion, bureaucratic frustration, and cultural distance. Some longed for retirement in England. Others buried themselves in administrative minutiae, schedules, inventories, records, hoping that order could substitute for connection. In the end, it wasn't rebellion alone that brought down the company. It was the cumulative weight of disconnection between rulers and ruled, between policies and realities, between the ideals of empire and the mechanisms of profit. And so it ended not with a bang, but with a signature. The company's final board meeting was held in 1874, where it was officially dissolved. Its legacy passed into the hands of imperial administrators, historians, and archivists. Its buildings remained, its railways expanded, and its policies echoed into the future. But the East India Company itself, that strange hybrid of merchant guild, colonial administrator, and sovereign state, had vanished. A paper empire built by clerks, undone by cartridges. A question lingers still. Could any empire governed not by shared purpose, but by ledger entries and sealed orders, have survived? Story 2. The Great Game. British and Russian Shadows over Central Asia. You may imagine espionage as a product of the modern world: spies in trench coats, microphones in ashtrays, and coded telegrams. But long before the Cold War, there was another great rivalry conducted in secret. The 19th century confrontation between the British and Russian empires over Central Asia. It would later be called the Great Game, but in its time, it was never formally declared nor clearly defined. There were no battle lines, only boundaries on maps and men with notebooks wandering the mountains. At the core of this imperial unease was a geographical mystery. Much of Central Asia, from Afghanistan to the highlands of Persia, from the Kazakh steppes to the Himalayas, remained largely unmapped by European powers. To those in London and St. Petersburg, it represented a blank space, a canvas onto which fears, ambitions, and misunderstandings were projected. The British, ruling India, feared a Russian march south. The Russians, expanding east from Moscow, feared British interference in the buffer zones of the east. The two empires rarely met in direct combat, yet they watched each other with growing suspicion, their couriers, cartographers, and consuls passing like shadows in mountain passes. It was a game played by surveyors, linguists, and political agents, many of whom would spend years in harsh terrains not fighting battles, but drawing lines, sending dispatches, and interpreting rumors. One of the earliest warning bells for Britain came with the Russian conquest of Khiva, Bukhara, and Kakand, independent Central Asian khanates that sat like dominoes north of Afghanistan. Between the 1830s and 1870s, the Tsar's armies moved through the deserts and oases, annexing territory not through grand declarations, but through treaties signed under pressure, military posts, and taxation agreements. Each conquest sent tremors through the corridors of Whitehall. Back in Simla, the summer capital of British India, civil servants pored over intelligence reports delivered by camel and train. They noted troop movements, letters intercepted, and rumors whispered by tribal chiefs. British officials like Lord Auckland, the Governor-General of India in the 1830s, came to believe that Afghanistan was the key highland fortress that must be secured to prevent Russian invasion of India. And so, with poor maps and questionable informants, Britain began its first Afghan war in 1839, a conflict that ended in humiliation. The war's origin lay not in open aggression but in diplomatic paranoia. British agents feared the Afghan ruler, Dost Mohammed Khan, might align with Russia. They decided to preempt this possibility by supporting a rival claimant, Shah Shuja, and marching an army through treacherous terrain to place him on the throne. It worked briefly. The British occupied Kabul, set up their administration, and attempted to govern a fiercely independent land with little understanding of its internal dynamics. The attempt was clumsy. British officers expected deference, issued reforms, and invited local suspicion. By 1842, the resistance was organized, and the uprising was total. The retreat from Kabul became one of the most infamous disasters in British military history. Of the nearly 16,000 soldiers and camp followers who left the city, only one European surgeon named Dr. William Brydon made it alive to Jalalabad, his exhausted horse collapsing at the gates. It was not a battle lost in strategy, but a lesson in the limits of imperial knowledge. And yet the great game continued. The British, despite the disaster, returned to Afghanistan in 1878 during the Second Afghan War, again fearing Russian influence. They would secure treaties, establish a British resident in Kabul, and maintain a thin hold on Afghan foreign policy. But beyond the military episodes, much of the great game was quiet and meticulous. British officers such as Captain Arthur Cannoli, who coined the term "great game" in a private letter, and Major Eldred Pottinger, known for his brave defense of Herat, traveled disguised as traders or Muslim scholars, their notes hidden in the seams of clothing. They mapped rivers and mountain passes, learned local dialects, and built networks of informants. The Russians, in turn, dispatched explorers like Nikolai Przhevalsky, who traveled through Tibet and the Gobi Desert under imperial commission. His expeditions collected zoological specimens, topographical data, and political insight. These men were not soldiers, at least not in the traditional sense. They were gentlemen spies, operating in a world of tribal politics, shifting alliances, and ambiguous frontiers. For both empires, cartography became a weapon. Every hill and valley documented was a potential military route. Every village recorded could host a garrison. The Himalayas, the Hindu Kush, and the Pamirs, once natural barriers, became focal points of anxiety. In the offices of the Survey of India, established in 1767, but vastly expanded during the 19th century, Indian surveyors known as pundits were trained to conduct covert explorations of forbidden regions. Pundits like Nain Singh Rawat, under assumed names and in native attire, crossed Tibet counting their paces with rosary beads modified to serve as measuring devices. They traveled without backup, carrying no official identification, and yet their surveys would become some of the most accurate maps of Inner Asia for decades. This work was not glamorous. It required silence, patience, and survival, months spent in cold, high-altitude terrain, meals scraped together from unfamiliar villages, data recorded at night, away from prying eyes. One mistake, a wrong accent, an exposed compass, and the punishment could be fatal. And still, these surveyors persevered. Their motivations varied. Some believed in empire, others sought adventure or recognition. But whatever their goals, they contributed to a knowledge base that turned the unknown into the governable. Back in Europe, debates unfolded over who truly owned these lands. But for those on the ground, ownership was less clear. Borders shifted not just with treaties, but with snowmelt, tribal migrations, and the lifespan of local warlords. The Great Game, for all its strategic posturing, was conducted in a landscape that resisted certainty. And at its heart, the game remained hypothetical. Russia never invaded India. Britain never invaded Moscow. Their rivalry was one of anticipation, of actions taken to prevent actions that never came. As the 19th century approached its final decades, new factors began to intrude: the telegraph, the railway, the Suez Canal. Technology shrank distances, made communication faster, and rendered some of the old spy routes obsolete. But the legacy of the Great Game endured in maps, in treaties, in lingering suspicion. As we pause here on a frozen ridge somewhere in the Hindu Kush, one must ask, was the Great Game truly a confrontation between empires, or was it a mirror reflecting their deepest fears? By the 1870s, the Great Game had matured into a slow-moving ritual of surveillance and subtlety. No longer a scramble of clandestine expeditions alone, it became increasingly defined by diplomatic maneuvering, infrastructure development, and the delicate placement of treaty lines on maps that few had ever walked. The British were still deeply entrenched in India, their anxieties about a northern invasion unrelenting. The Russians, having consolidated their hold over Central Asian khanates, were pressing further south toward the Oxus River, now known as the Amu Darya, which lay perilously close to Afghanistan. Each mile of Russian progress was reported with urgency to Simla and Whitehall. And yet, for all the tension, the war so often feared between these two empires never quite materialized. Instead, they found themselves locked in a quieter struggle over treaties, railway tracks, and influence. The Treaty of Gandamak in 1879 was one such diplomatic chess piece. After the Second Anglo-Afghan War, which had ended in a tenuous British victory, the treaty allowed the British to control Afghanistan's foreign policy while ceding some frontier areas. The Afghans, nominally independent, had their sovereignty now filtered through British consulates and advisors. This model, indirect rule through advisory positions, became increasingly popular. It required fewer troops and created fewer headlines, while allowing Britain to monitor Russian movements with at least a semblance of local legitimacy. Meanwhile, the Russians were building railways. This, more than any treaty, marked a turning point in Central Asia. The Trans-Caspian Railway, begun in the 1880s, connected the Caspian Sea to the heart of Turkestan. Though built under the banner of development, it served a clear military function. Troops and supplies could now be moved swiftly across vast steppes. To the British, this was alarming. They still lacked a direct rail link into the northwestern frontier of India. Worse, the telegraph lines, the latest marvel of modern communication, were also being extended through Persia and into Russian territory. The Russians could now move faster, talk faster, and respond faster than ever before. In response, British surveyors resumed their work in earnest. Areas such as Baluchistan, Gilgit, and Chitral, once remote and of marginal interest, were now of central strategic importance. British agents like Colonel Charles Metcalfe MacGregor and Captain Francis Younghusband ventured into the high passes of the Karakoram and Pamirs, taking notes on altitudes, road widths, and local loyalties. But more often than not, the real battle was fought at drawing tables. In 1885, the Panjshir incident brought the Great Game to the brink of war. Russian forces advanced into Afghan territory near the oasis of Panjshir, clashing with Afghan troops. Britain, bound by treaty to defend Afghanistan's borders, prepared for war. Troops were mobilized. Telegrams flashed between London, St. Petersburg, and Calcutta. Then, quite suddenly, diplomacy prevailed. The two empires, realizing the cost of war might far outweigh the benefits, chose negotiation. The Anglo-Russian Boundary Commission was formed, and for months it wandered the barren stretches of northern Afghanistan, trying to fix invisible lines across rugged deserts and valleys. The British were represented by Sir West Ridgway, the Russians by General Zelenoy. Their teams measured, argued, and drank tea. Occasionally, shots were fired not at each other, but at wolves or for ceremonial salutes. The Panjshir crisis had shown how fragile the situation was and how remarkably restrained both powers could be when the stakes were clarified. The final agreement drew a boundary that left Panjshir in Russian hands, but reaffirmed Afghanistan as a buffer state. The agreement was quiet, technical, and deeply anticlimactic, the very essence of the Great Game. And so, through slow consensus and surveying, modern Afghanistan was born not through local consensus or historical precedent, but through the quiet arguments of foreign commissioners with maps and compasses. Still, the region remained tense. In Gilgit, British concerns about Russian influence led to a bizarre arrangement, the creation of the Gilgit Agency in 1889. This was a remote frontier post where British officers lived among tribal populations, monitoring the high passes. They employed local scouts, hosted village chiefs, and filed reports by candlelight. The environment was harsh, the work monotonous, and the directives from Simla vague. Yet every whisper of Russian movement received careful attention. The Russians, too, became obsessed with influence. They supported friendly leaders in Persia, provided aid to sympathetic tribes, and extended their railway network ever closer to British interests. Their actions were not overtly hostile, but they pushed boundaries, probing, testing, encircling. Ironically, the British and Russian representatives in the region often respected one another, even shared information. In cities like Tehran, where both powers had legations, their diplomats socialized, exchanged gossip, and compared notes. It was not uncommon for British officers to toast their Russian counterparts over Persian tea. This curious civility masked the underlying reality. The Great Game was increasingly about influence, not territory. Neither empire truly wanted war, they wanted assurance that their interests would not be threatened. So they drew lines, signed protocols, and staffed outposts with mid-ranking officers who sent back dry dispatches full of uncertainty. One such agreement was the Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907. This formalized what had long been informally practiced. Persia was divided into spheres of influence, the north for Russia, the south for Britain, and a neutral zone in the center. Afghanistan was confirmed as under British influence. Tibet, long a matter of dispute, was to remain autonomous. This convention effectively ended the competitive phase of the Great Game. Neither side had won, but they had avoided open war. The lines were drawn, the treaties filed, and the focus of imperial rivalry began to shift elsewhere toward Europe, East Asia, and eventually to global conflict. But the legacy of this strange, subtle contest lingered. The borders drawn during the Great Game, particularly those of Afghanistan, Persia, Iran, and the tribal areas of Pakistan, would become flashpoints in the 20th century. The mistrust it sowed between East and West persisted through Soviet times and even into the post-colonial era. And perhaps most curiously, the true heroes of the Great Game were not generals or kings, but surveyors, translators, negotiators, and footsore agents who trudged through silence, gathering data, chasing shadows. One wonders, did they know how much of history they were shaping, or did it all seem like just another assignment, in just another remote outpost, with just another report to file? By the early 20th century, the Great Game was no longer a game. The final treaties had been signed, the borders more or less fixed. The Anglo-Russian Convention of 1907 had carved up spheres of influence across Persia, Afghanistan, and Tibet with the cold precision of pen and paper. What had once been a fluid contest of shadowy agents and anxious reports was now a frozen structure of diplomacy. Yet for the people living within the lines, the Afghans, the Persians, the Uzbeks, the Kazakhs, and countless tribal groups, these drawn boundaries were rarely recognized. Villages straddled borders that no one had ever heard of. Water sources were now divided between empires, trade routes disrupted, kinship networks fragmented. The legacy of the Great Game was not war, but the administrative ordering of ambiguity. Take Afghanistan, for instance. By 1919, the Third Anglo-Afghan War had been fought and concluded. It was short and relatively bloodless, but its consequences were sharp. Britain formally relinquished control over Afghanistan's foreign policy. The country became fully independent. Yet the Durand Line, drawn in 1893 between Afghanistan and British India, remained. Originally negotiated by Sir Mortimer Durand and Afghan ruler Abdur Rahman Khan, the line had been intended to demarcate influence. Instead, it became a permanent and still contested international border, dividing the Pashtun tribes across two states. The people on either side of the line had no say in its placement, and that, more than any skirmish or treaty, may be the most enduring legacy of the Great Game: borders without consent. In Persia, the influence of Britain and Russia deepened after 1907, with each power effectively dominating their respective zones. British engineers managed southern ports and customs houses. Russian troops patrolled the north. A Persian constitutional revolution in 1905–1911 attempted to assert national sovereignty and democracy, but the presence of imperial powers made any real independence difficult. It was a quiet domination conducted not through garrisons but through bank loans, infrastructure contracts, and consular oversight. And what of Central Asia? The Russian Empire fully absorbed the khanates of Bukhara, Khiva, and Kakand, turning them into protectorates or administrative regions. Roads, railways, and schools were introduced, but traditional structures were often dismantled or sidelined. The region became a source of cotton for Russia's textile industry, a classic case of imperial economic integration without local benefit. British India, meanwhile, settled into the high colonial period. Gilgit, Chitral, and the northwest frontier were fortified, not with large armies but with small garrisons, forts, and a dense network of intelligence posts. The frontier was governed less by direct rule and more through tribal negotiations, subsidies, and punitive expeditions when local leaders failed to comply. The game's players, the Younghusbands, the Ridgeways, the MacGregors, retired, wrote memoirs, or passed into quiet obscurity. Their journeys had been difficult, and their discoveries were often of marginal strategic value. They had measured rivers, mapped villages, and attended tribal meetings with careful notes, all to prevent a war that never came. And that may be the strangest part of it all. The Great Game was a rivalry built on anticipation. The fear that the other side might act first drove decades of policy, but neither Russia nor Britain truly sought direct conquest in the contested zones. Instead, they sought influence, buffer zones, and predictability. But in seeking those things, they sowed division, mistrust, and fragmentation. One must pause to consider the paradox. The very borders drawn to prevent war later became causes of conflict. The Dur-En line has been disputed for over a century. The division of Persia weakened its state structures, and in the post-colonial era, the nations shaped by these imperial games would struggle to reconcile their identities with the borders left behind. Perhaps the most revealing feature of the Great Game was the mindset it instilled. Territory as chessboard, populations as statistics, and sovereignty as negotiable. Even today, echoes of this thinking can be heard in policy discussions, in map rooms, in the dry language of security analysts. The Great Game did not end with a battle, a treaty, or a parade. It faded out as the empires that played it turned their attention elsewhere. The world wars would soon reframe geopolitics entirely. Russia would become the Soviet Union. The British Empire would crumble. Yet the borders remained. The lines carved in snow and sand by men with measuring chains, prayer beads, and tin compasses would outlive the empires themselves. And so the question lingers, quietly and indefinitely. What happens when boundaries, once imagined for security, become cages for those who never imagined them at all? Story 3. The Annexation of Burma, Slow March into the Jungle. The story of British Burma is not one of swift conquest or stirring declarations. It unfolded gradually, like a boat drifting upriver, meandering, hesitant, and bound more by the tide than the oars. Unlike the grand campaigns of Europe or the sweeping dramas of rebellion in India, the annexation of Burma was driven by miscommunication, economic ambition, and the slow accumulation of paperwork and pretext. In the early 19th century, Burma was a sovereign kingdom, ruled by the Konbaung dynasty from the city of Ava and later Mandalay. It was not a minor state. Its kings held sway over a territory that reached into modern-day Thailand, Assam, and Yunnan. Yet to the British busy consolidating their hold over India, Burma was at first merely a neighbor. The first formal contact came through trade. The British East India Company, ever eager to expand its commercial reach, sought access to Burma's valuable teak forests, rich oil deposits, and bustling rice markets. Teak was particularly prized, used for shipbuilding, railway ties, and construction. Burma's forests were among the densest in Asia, but they lay under royal monopoly, guarded by local officials and tribal chiefs. In the early 1820s, this commercial interest clashed with political friction. The Burmese king Bajidao, aiming to expand his influence, launched incursions into Assam and Manipur, areas that British India considered within its growing sphere. Skirmishes followed, along poorly defined borders. The company, still bruised by earlier conflicts in India, saw this as provocation. Thus began the First Anglo-Burmese War, 1824–1826. A conflict that would become, ironically, the most expensive war in the East India Company's history, despite few major battles. It was not the war itself that proved costly, but the logistics. Troops had to be transported by sea to Rangoon, then marched inland through thick jungle. Disease, especially malaria and dysentery, claimed more lives than enemy fire. Supply lines broke down. Tropical heat rotted uniforms and ruined gunpowder. British officers wrote long, dull reports filled with complaints about transport, maps, and sick horses. The war ended with the Treaty of Yandabo in 1826. The British gained Assam, Arakan, and Tenasserim border regions rich in timber and minerals, but not the heart of Burma itself. Rangoon and Mandalay remained in Burmese hands. The company's ambitions, for the moment, were restrained. But the treaty also required the Burmese to pay an indemnity of £1 million, a sum that devastated their treasury. It pushed the Burmese court towards suspicion and seclusion, while pushing the British further into the idea that Burma was a failing state, ripe for influence or intervention. By the 1850s, British Burma, the annexed coastal territories, had become part of the company's Indian empire. Ports like Moulmein and Akyab grew as trading hubs. British administrators and merchants arrived to manage customs, build roads, and ship out timber. Meanwhile, in Upper Burma, the royal court continued to govern independently, though with declining power. It was a curious duality. Two Burmas, one under company rule, measured and documented, the other traditional, monarchical, and opaque to British eyes. The tipping point came in the 1870s and 1880s, during the reign of King Thibaw, Burma's last monarch. His court in Mandalay became the focus of British suspicion. There were rumors, some true, many exaggerated, of mass executions, court intrigue, and increasing ties with the French. France, already active in nearby Indochina, had begun sending emissaries and exploring commercial ties with Mandalay. To British minds steeped in the logic of empire, this was a threat. At the same time, British merchants in Rangoon were pressing for more access to the interior. The Irrawaddy River, the great artery of Burmese commerce, was off-limits beyond a certain point. Steamships were blocked. Contracts for timber extraction were complicated by royal monopolies and bribes. And so, pressure built not just from Whitehall, but from Burma-based businessmen. Then, in 1885, the pretext arrived. The French firm Mason Holt was granted timber rights in Upper Burma, and the British-owned Bombay Burma Trading Corporation was fined by the Burmese government for underreporting its exports. British authorities, seizing the opportunity, declared the treatment of the corporation as a violation of international norms. It was a technical dispute essentially, an argument about timber tariffs. But it would trigger the Third Anglo-Burmese War. This war, like the first, was brief and anticlimactic. British troops sailed to Rangoon, marched quickly up the Irrawaddy, and occupied Mandalay with minimal resistance. King Thibaw, unprepared and unpopular, surrendered without significant fighting. He and his queen were exiled to Ratnagiri, a coastal town in western India. Their court was dissolved. Mandalay Palace was converted into army barracks. Burma was declared annexed quietly, without public ceremony, and with barely any mention in British newspapers. The annexation, officially proclaimed on January 1, 1886, merged Upper Burma with the British Indian Empire. The administrative language used was precise, cold, and filled with bureaucratic terms. There was no grand celebration, just orders, reports, and routine files added to the stacks in Calcutta. Yet the conquest, though bloodless at the top, ignited widespread resistance in the countryside. Local nobles, monks, and displaced soldiers known as dacoits in British records began a slow and quiet campaign of guerrilla resistance. They attacked patrols, ambushed convoys, and sabotaged telegraph lines. The British responded not with diplomacy, but with small military columns, curfews, and the burning villages policy, a system of collective punishment. Still, much of the British administration treated this period as business as usual. Officials filed quarterly reports. Surveyors drew new maps. Judges applied the Indian Penal Code to Burmese villages. Civil servants discussed road construction, forest revenue, and land registration, as if the jungle were just another province awaiting proper governance. Mandalay became a district capital. Monasteries were catalogued. Buddhist relics were boxed and sent to museums in London. This was conquest by routine, not by glory. By the early 1890s, open resistance had dwindled, suppressed by attrition and exhaustion. Burma had become, administratively, just another province of British India, governed by the Indian Civil Service, subject to Indian laws and taxed under Indian codes. But the Burmese people had not forgotten. To many, the quiet removal of their king, the disappearance of royal rituals, the rewriting of land ownership was a spiritual loss. British rule was not only foreign, but alien in rhythm. It replaced festivals with timetables, parables with paperwork, and lineage with land deeds. Even the British acknowledged this discomfort. One commissioner wrote that the Burmese, while outwardly peaceful, remain unassimilated in thought and practice. They obey but do not believe. The sentence, though buried in a long administrative letter, captures the mood perfectly. As the century drew to a close, teak flowed out of the ports, rice exports soared, and British investors profited. But beneath this prosperity was a lingering silence, a people who had not been defeated in battle, so much as absorbed through error, misunderstanding, and economic ambition. It leaves one to wonder, when an empire expands not by force, but by accounting disputes and overreaching charters, does it even realize what it has taken? If the conquest of Upper Burma had been swift, its consolidation was anything but. In the decades following the 1885 annexation, British administrators discovered that winning a palace was far simpler than ruling a forest. Unlike other parts of the British Empire, where colonial authority was projected through legal codes and magistrates, in post-annexation Burma, the first task was not administration but pacification. And it was a long, muddy, and mostly thankless process. From 1886 to well into the early 1890s, British reports regularly referred to Upper Burma as unsettled territory. The countryside teemed with dacoits, a catch-all term the British used to describe bandits, rebels, former soldiers, and freedom fighters. Some were motivated by political resistance. Others took up arms to defend local customs. Many simply turned to banditry in the wake of the king's fall. For the British, these groups presented an ongoing challenge, not in terms of battlefield defeats, but in the form of constant low-level disruption. Ambushes on postal convoys, burned tax offices, and killed or kidnapped clerks. To respond, the British deployed small mobile military units, often composed of Indian sepoys, Gurkha soldiers, and native police. Their orders were to patrol the countryside, enforce curfews, and restore order, sometimes by burning entire villages suspected of harboring resistance. This policy was known, in euphemistic dispatches, as punitive action. One recurring problem, however, was intelligence or lack thereof. Most British officials spoke little or no Burmese. They relied heavily on interpreters, often drawn from minority ethnic groups such as the Karens, Shans, or Chins, who had long-standing grievances against the Burman majority. These intermediaries were not always neutral and often manipulated information for their own advantage. Moreover, the British administrative framework was ill-suited to the terrain. In Calcutta or Bombay, laws could be enforced by summoning lawyers and judges, by sending letters and citations. But in the hills of Sagaing or the jungles of Shwibo, control depended more on personal alliances and military presence. Civil officers soon realized they were not building a government, they were managing a garrison. One such figure was Sir Charles Crosthwaite, the Chief Commissioner of Burma. In long annual reports to the Viceroy, he detailed the difficulty of managing a land where the law was not known, nor asked for. He described a landscape in which colonial officers had to balance force and diplomacy, tax and tact, and where the best outcome was often temporary quiet rather than permanent loyalty. Crosthwaite and others like him began to experiment with indirect rule, empowering local village headmen to act as intermediaries, collecting taxes and enforcing minor regulations. But unlike in India, Burma lacked a traditional caste hierarchy or zamindar class that could be easily co-opted. Authority was decentralized. The Burmese Sangha, or monastic community, held immense influence, especially in rural areas. This brought the British face to face with a new administrative dilemma: the monks. While not politically organized, Burma's Buddhist clergy were deeply respected, and their criticism carried weight. Many had opposed British rule, particularly when it involved changes to education and land tenure. Monasteries had traditionally functioned as schools and record keepers. British attempts to introduce Western schooling were seen not as educational improvement, but as cultural intrusion. In response, some monks began to harbor fugitives, spread anti-British pamphlets, or refuse cooperation with local officers. Yet their status as religious figures made them difficult to confront directly. British administrators, wary of inflaming local sentiment, often avoided direct conflict with the Sangha, even when their influence undermined state control. Meanwhile, in the cities and ports, a different process was unfolding: the quiet layering of bureaucracy. Rangoon, once a minor fishing town, became the colonial capital. From there, governors issued circulars, reviewed censuses, and standardized taxation. A railway was built to link Rangoon with Mandalay, cutting through forests and farmlands, bringing in new workers and carrying out timber, oil, and rice. Urbanization, though slow, began to reshape the colonial economy. Indian laborers and clerks were brought in to staff the lower rungs of the administration. British officers filled senior posts. Burmese elites, often merchants or landowners, found themselves caught in the middle, essential to administration, yet denied real authority. A small class of Burma-born British subjects, educated in colonial schools, began to emerge. But for most rural Burmese, the state remained distant. Its presence felt only through taxes, occasional patrols, and land assessments. Cultural friction deepened as British law replaced Burmese customary systems. For instance, inheritance in Burmese society often passed through matrilineal lines, and marriages were informal and easily dissolved. British laws, based on Victorian norms, imposed more rigid definitions of family and property, undermining long-standing traditions. Civil disputes multiplied. Courts became clogged. Officials complained of frivolous appeals, not realizing they had destabilized long-held norms. Yet the colonial machine continued to hum. Reports were filed, censuses conducted, forests surveyed and managed by the Imperial Forestry Service, tax codes refined. Every year, revenue from rice exports and teak increased. British companies profited handsomely. Shareholders in London rarely heard about the bandit problem, only about rail dividends and timber yields. But the resistance never fully disappeared. Instead, it adapted. By the early 20th century, opposition had taken on a new form: cultural nationalism. Monks, teachers, and writers began emphasizing Burmese identity and Buddhist values in subtle ways, publishing journals, forming literary societies, and promoting the use of the Burmese language in education. This wasn't open rebellion. It was quiet assertion, the slow replanting of roots beneath the surface of a foreign administration. British officers, for the most part, underestimated it. They preferred clear metrics: number of arrests, length of railway laid, rice tonnage exported. But beneath those numbers, a sense of unease was growing: the realization that order was not consent, and that peace was not permanence. Indeed, by the 1920s and 1930s, that cultural undercurrent would mature into political demands, strikes, and mass movements. But for now, in the final decades of the 19th century, the British were content with their peaceful colony, even if that peace had been purchased by thousands of foot patrols, stacks of legal code, and the silence of a conquered capital. One wonders, in a land where rule was enforced by spreadsheets and patrol routes, could true belonging ever take root? By the early 20th century, Burma had become what British officials liked to call a model colony. The rebellions of the 1880s and 1890s were subdued. The jungle patrols grew less frequent. Railways stretched deeper into the forests. Revenue officers sent regular reports to Rangoon, and Rangoon sent them on to Calcutta. In terms of imperial order, Burma had settled. But this sense of calm was misleading. Beneath the routines of governance, the colony remained unassimilated. It was quiet not because it had accepted British rule, but because it had learned how to wait. Resistance, once open and armed, had become cultural, cautious, and patient. Life in colonial Burma during the early 1900s was a life shaped by external rhythms. In the countryside, farmers paid taxes in rupees, not in rice or labor as they had done for generations. They now grew rice for export, not for local consumption, bound to the fluctuations of global grain markets. The British had mechanized rice milling, and merchants in Rangoon, many of them Indian or Chinese, now controlled its sale and transport. The Burmese peasantry, once largely self-sufficient, became economically dependent. When prices fell, as they did during periodic downturns, many lost their land to moneylenders. The colonial courts, favoring contract law over custom, upheld these foreclosures. Thus, slowly and silently, a class of landless laborers emerged. This erosion of autonomy wasn't dramatic. It happened through legal notices, survey forms, and auction announcements posted in town centers. At the same time, the urban landscape was changing. Rangoon, with its grid-patterned streets and gas-lit boulevards, became a bustling colonial capital. Its skyline featured both Buddhist pagodas and Victorian clock towers. British officials, Indian clerks, Chinese merchants, and Burmese workers lived in different neighborhoods, rarely interacting outside the workplace. The segregation was not formally written into law, but it existed in housing ordinances, school admissions, and social clubs. British civil servants belonged to the Rangoon Club. Indian traders had their own institutions. Burmese intellectuals met in monastery halls and tea shops. In those tea shops, a new voice began to rise, a voice shaped not by rebellion, but by language, literature, and loss. By the 1910s, Burmese newspapers like Thuria, The Sun, and Myanmar Ailen, The Light of Burma, were publishing articles that blended modern journalism with Buddhist moral critique. Writers lamented the decline of native customs. They criticized the erosion of Buddhist education. They questioned the ethics of foreign rule, not with calls for violence, but with questions about justice and identity. The monks, once targeted during the era of military resistance, became cultural leaders. They hosted lectures, taught traditional scripture, and encouraged literacy. Their sermons often emphasized national pride, couched in religious metaphors. They did not preach revolution, they reminded people of who they had been and who they could be. Meanwhile, a new generation of Burmese students was emerging. Educated in colonial schools taught English, mathematics, and history, these young men and women walked between two worlds. They recited Kipling and Shakespeare in classrooms by day, then returned home to families who still followed the lunar calendar and village festivals. Many felt disoriented, but some found purpose in the gap. In 1920, students at Rangoon College led the first university strike in Burma's history. The cause was modest, a protest against new fees and curriculum changes, but the act itself was revolutionary. It was not a riot. It was a boycott, organized and disciplined. The movement spread to other towns. Temporary schools, known as national schools, were created, staffed by monks, retired teachers, and volunteers. These institutions blended Western education with Burmese culture, and they became the seedbed for political consciousness. The British administration, in response, followed a familiar script: commissions, partial reforms, and limited representation. In 1923, under the Montagu-Chelmsford reforms, Burma was granted a legislative council and elected body with minimal power. It was a gesture of inclusivity, but most Burmese saw it for what it was: a delaying mechanism. In the villages, meanwhile, agrarian grievances continued to grow. By the 1930s, landlessness had reached alarming levels. Many tenant farmers were paying half their annual yield in rent. Debt was widespread, and yet British reports often painted these problems as economic, not political. The discontent, they believed, could be addressed with better credit schemes, cooperatives, or land reform policies that were rarely enacted. But resentment was quietly boiling. In 1930, the Saya San rebellion erupted in central Burma. Led by a former monk claiming to restore Burmese kingship and resist taxation, the movement began with rural marches and symbolic rituals. The British dismissed it at first, but it soon engulfed entire districts. Police stations were attacked, government offices burned, land records destroyed. The rebellion lasted nearly 2 years. British forces eventually crushed it with military expeditions, aerial bombings, and public executions. Over 10,000 people were arrested. Hundreds were sentenced to long prison terms. But once again, British officials missed the message. They wrote long after-action reports, focused on restoring order and improving rural administration. Few considered what it meant that tens of thousands of villagers had followed a barefoot mystic into open defiance. The calm returned, but it was thinner now. More political parties formed, most notably the Dobama Association, We Burmans Association, which rejected colonial identity and promoted the slogan, "Burma is our country, Burmese is our language, and Buddhism is our religion." These were not radicals. They were students, teachers, clerks, people raised in the very system they now opposed. By the late 1930s, the British began to see the writing on the wall. Burma was no longer a docile colony. The intellectual ferment, economic grievances, and religious revivalism had converged into a nationalist awakening. In 1937, recognizing the unique trajectory of Burmese politics, the British formally separated Burma from British India and made it a distinct colony. It was again a bureaucratic decision. Files were transferred, titles revised, a new capital was planned. But the people had already moved beyond paperwork. As the Second World War loomed and Japanese ambitions spread across Asia, Burma would become a crucial battleground not just in geopolitics, but in the long-delayed reckoning of imperial rule. And yet, as we return to the forest roads and riverbanks where this story began, we are left with a strange truth. Burma was not taken by force, it was misunderstood into submission. Its kings dismissed, its customs overwritten, its economy redirected, all under the belief that stability had been achieved. But it hadn't. The quiet that followed the annexation was not the silence of peace, it was the pause before a voice returns. Story 4, The Scramble for Africa, Bureaucrats, Boundaries, and Blunders. If you were to glance at a political map of Africa today, with its crisp, straight borders and neat national names, you might assume those lines arose from careful negotiation between African peoples. But in reality, many of those boundaries were born not in the deserts or rainforests of the continent, but in drafty conference halls thousands of miles away, in a time when Africa was being treated not as a land of nations, but as a collection of resources, rivers, and revenues. At the center of this transformation was a series of events historians now call the Scramble for Africa, the rapid division of nearly the entire continent among European empires during the late 19th century, culminating in the Berlin Conference of 1884-85. But the term scramble is a little misleading. It suggests chaos. In truth, it was often orderly, bureaucratic, and disturbingly quiet. Before 1880, much of Africa, especially inland, remained unknown to European cartographers. The coastal regions were dotted with trading forts, mission stations, and colonial outposts, especially by the British, French, Portuguese, and Dutch. Inland, however, were powerful kingdoms, nomadic territories, and self-governing societies that Europeans neither understood nor tried to govern directly. That changed with the rise of industrial capitalism, and with it, a growing appetite for raw materials: rubber, ivory, gold, palm oil, and, increasingly, strategic control of river systems and trade corridors. European governments, under pressure from business interests and driven by a cultural mission to civilize, began expanding into Africa in earnest. Yet their imperial ambitions soon overlapped. France was pushing inland from West Africa. Britain was expanding from the Cape Colony. Germany, newly unified under Bismarck in 1871, sought overseas colonies for national prestige. Belgium, under King Leopold II, eyed the Congo with private interest cloaked in humanitarian rhetoric. To prevent direct military confrontation and to maintain order in the Imperial Club, a conference was proposed. The venue, Berlin. Beginning in November 1884, representatives from 14 nations including Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, and even the Ottoman Empire gathered under the watchful eye of German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. No African leaders were invited. No African societies were consulted. The Berlin Conference was not about understanding Africa. It was about dividing it. The official purpose was to settle claims peacefully and establish effective occupation as the basis for territorial control. In essence, if a European power could administer, police, and develop an area, it had the right to claim it. This gave rise to what would become one of the most absurd chapters in colonial history: the race to map, claim, and formalize control, often through treaties signed with confused or coerced local rulers, and through boundary lines drawn by European officials who had never set foot in the areas they were dividing. One of the most illustrative examples is the boundary between Nigeria and Cameroon, drawn as a compromise between British and German ambitions. On the map, it curves in unnatural shapes, based on lines of latitude, mountain ridges, and imaginary rivers. Entire villages found themselves split down the middle. Ethnic groups that had existed for centuries were assigned to different colonial authorities overnight. In East Africa, the situation was no better. When the British and Germans negotiated their spheres of influence in what would become Tanzania and Kenya, they did so using a combination of geographic ignorance and imperial logic. A line was drawn from the coast near Mombasa, across the interior, supposedly separating the two zones. Unfortunately, that line ran through the territory of the Maasai, who now found themselves governed by two colonial administrations, neither of which understood their pastoralist lifestyle. Meanwhile, Belgium was granted control of the vast Congo Free State, a personal possession of King Leopold II. Though the Berlin Conference established some humanitarian guidelines, including the promise to end the slave trade and allow free navigation on major rivers, Leopold quickly turned the Congo into a site of extraction and exploitation. His agents established quotas for rubber and ivory, enforced by violence and mutilation. Villages that failed to meet quotas were burned. Resistance was met with massacre. And yet, in European capitals, these developments were often framed in terms of progress. Colonial offices received reports filled with charts: rubber exported, roads built, telegraph lines installed. There was little mention of the forced labor, broken families, or suppressed uprisings. In London, the British approach was more bureaucratic than brutal, but still marked by distance and miscalculation. The British Colonial Office worked with mapmakers, chartered companies, and military officers to extend influence across Africa. Their method often involved treaties, signed under duress or misinterpreted by African rulers. In some cases, local leaders believed they were signing agreements of friendship or mutual defense. British administrators interpreted these as declarations of sovereignty. One such case involved the Ashanti Kingdom in West Africa. Located in what is now Ghana, the Ashanti had maintained independence for centuries and controlled a large, organized state with a centralized bureaucracy. In 1896, after a series of conflicts, the British sent a military expedition to Kumasi, the Ashanti capital. The king was exiled, and the kingdom annexed not with a declaration, but with a memo and a flag change. British officials soon discovered what many empires had before: Africa was not empty, nor easily tamed. In the years that followed, colonial governors filed reports filled with complaints about language barriers, sparse infrastructure, resistance from local chiefs, and difficult terrain. They requested translators, more clerks, and advice on how to collect taxes in societies that did not use coinage. The solutions were rarely innovative. In many cases, Taxes were collected in kind in cattle, labor, or crops, and administered by newly appointed local chiefs who owed their positions to European endorsement rather than traditional legitimacy. This system, known as indirect rule, was a hallmark of British administration. It sought to govern through existing structures, but where those structures didn't exist, they were invented. This led to the rise of warrant chiefs, men with little prior authority who were elevated by colonial decree and resented by the very people they were meant to govern. And still, the paperwork continued. In colonial offices across Africa, files were created, stamped, and stored. Reports were written on cattle counts, vaccination numbers, court cases resolved, and kilometers of railway track laid. The rhythms of administration, slow, deliberate, and detached, gave the illusion of order. But on the ground, the consequences were mounting. Borders cut across trade routes and cultural zones. People were displaced to make room for plantations. Languages were suppressed in favor of the colonizer's tongue, and systems of justice were replaced by unfamiliar legal codes written in English, French, or German. By the turn of the 20th century, nearly 90% of Africa was under European control. Only Ethiopia and Liberia remained formally independent, and even these were under intense diplomatic pressure. The scramble had been successful at least from the perspective of imperial powers. Yet the map they produced was fragile, based on assumptions of compliance, and resting on boundaries no local communities had ever recognized. It is worth pausing to ask, what happens when lines are drawn not to reflect reality, but to replace it? By the early 1900s, Africa had been claimed on paper. European maps showed a continent carved neatly into territories with names like British East Africa, German Cameroon, French West Africa, and Anglo-Egyptian Sudan. But these names, and the clean lines they sat within, bore little resemblance to the lived reality of the people within them. The European empires believed they had established order. In truth, what they had constructed was a vast apparatus of assumed control, propped up by treaties few could read, tax systems few accepted, and governments few respected. The actual administration of these new African colonies fell to colonial officers often young, ambitious, and profoundly underprepared. A junior officer posted to an interior district might be expected to govern tens of thousands of people, manage taxes, resolve disputes, supervise public works, and maintain peace sometimes without even a fluent interpreter. To make administration possible, colonial governments turned to the policy of indirect rule, especially in British-controlled territories. The principle was simple: rule through local leaders. The practice, however, was anything but. In places where centralized kingdoms already existed, such as the Buganda Kingdom in Uganda or the Emirates of northern Nigeria, this model worked with relative smoothness. The British simply inserted themselves at the top of the political pyramid, replacing the king's or emir's foreign policy with their own, while preserving local customs and tax systems. Reports flowed up, orders flowed down. But in decentralized societies, those without kings or hierarchical systems, the British created authority where none had previously existed. This often involved identifying a local elder or wealthy figure and declaring them chief by warrant. The problem was that these individuals frequently lacked any cultural or social legitimacy. They were colonial constructs, visible to the government, but alien to the communities they were meant to lead. In places like Sierra Leone, Kenya, and parts of Ghana, this gave rise to what historians call the invention of tradition. The British, needing order, documented new customs, installed new chiefs, and codified laws that had previously existed only as oral understandings. Once recorded in the colonial record, these invented structures became fixed, unchanging, inflexible, and enforceable by law. In other words, the British did not merely administer Africa. They reimagined it according to the needs of their bureaucracy. Taxation was among the most difficult problems. Colonial officials were tasked with extracting revenue, often with little understanding of local economies. The solution was typically a hut tax, a flat fee imposed on each household, payable in coin. But coin was not widely used in rural economies. People traded in grain, cattle, cloth, and labor. To pay the tax, many Africans had to enter the cash economy for the first time, often by working on plantations, in mines, or for government projects. This transformation was not a natural economic shift, it was a compulsion. In Kenya, for instance, the introduction of taxes coincided with the expropriation of the best agricultural land for white settlers. Africans were pushed off ancestral lands, forced into wage labor, and taxed for the privilege. The colonial government recorded this as development, but to the people experiencing it, it felt like displacement followed by punishment. The same pattern repeated across the continent. In French West Africa, the system was more centralized. The French implemented direct rule, insisting on the superiority of French culture, language, and law. Chiefs were viewed as civil servants, not independent rulers. Education was provided but only in French. Legal cases were heard but only in French courts. The goal was not partnership, but assimilation into French civilization. The result was a colony that appeared orderly, but was governed with little regard for local identities. Villagers who once settled disputes through negotiation were now summoned to courtrooms, where unfamiliar legal codes were read aloud, sometimes by interpreters who misunderstood both sides. In Belgian Congo, the rule was even more brutal, a mix of corporate exploitation and state control. Villages were required to meet rubber quotas, under the threat of punishment. The infamous policy of severing hands as proof of killings introduced under Leopold II's private regime was slowly curtailed under public pressure, but violence and coercion continued under the Belgian colonial state after 1908. All the while, in European capitals, reports arrived by the crate. Every year, colonial governors submitted annual reports, lengthy, data-rich documents filled with statistics. Miles of road built, taxes collected, schools opened, crimes prosecuted, rubber exported, tin mined. These were often accompanied by photographs of model villages, uniformed schoolchildren, clinics, and market stalls. To British and French officials reading these reports, Africa was improving. Progress was being made. But they rarely saw the other side of the ledger. The depopulated villages, the women laboring on forced public works, the elders sidelined by new authorities, or the children conscripted into mission schools that banned their language and religion. Communication between colonial centers and the interior remained slow. Many outposts had no telegraph, and roads were impassable in the rainy season. Colonial officers worked in isolation, sometimes going months without oversight. This created pockets of arbitrary rule, where a district commissioner's personality mattered more than any official policy. In some areas, officers tried to govern humanely, adjusting taxes, respecting customs, learning languages. In others, they ruled by intimidation and decree, holding court with the threat of prison or fines always near at hand. This inconsistency bred confusion and resentment. To the villagers, the colonial state was opaque. Laws changed with little warning. Chiefs were promoted or removed without explanation. Taxes increased without clear reason. Appeals to justice often went unanswered. What could be trusted? Religion provided one answer. Christian missions expanded rapidly during this period. They built schools, hospitals, and churches offering literacy and medicine, but also demanding conversion. In many cases, missions acted as unofficial arms of the colonial state, promoting obedience, hygiene, and European norms. But they also became sites of resistance, offering education that some Africans used to challenge colonial authority. One such figure was John Chilmbwe, a mission-educated Baptist pastor in Nyasaland, modern-day Malawi, who led an uprising in 1915 against British rule. His revolt was quickly crushed, but his ideas lived on, inspiring later independence movements. Elsewhere, Islamic scholars and traders resisted French and British encroachment through sermons, migration, and the creation of alternative religious communities. These forms of resistance were not armed, but they undermined colonial legitimacy, offering a parallel moral order. Meanwhile, in Europe, colonial exhibitions showcased Africa to curious crowds. Villagers were brought to Paris or London, dressed in traditional attire, and displayed as examples of the civilizing mission. Visitors marveled at their exotic appearance, unaware that the systems which had uprooted their lives were being quietly presented as benevolent. By the eve of the First World War, Africa had become a continent governed, mapped, and measured but not understood. Colonial governments believed they had created order. In truth, they had created a fragile web of assumptions that chiefs would obey, that workers would labor, that taxes would be paid, that borders would hold. What they had really built was a continent of administrative friction, files that contradicted local customs, maps that ignored mountain ranges, and laws enforced by men with rubber stamps, rifles, and little knowledge of the people they ruled. It raises a quiet but profound question. Can a system built on misunderstandings, however neat its paperwork, ever claim to be just? By the early 20th century, the imperial map of Africa was complete, or so it seemed. The major European powers had divided the continent into colonies and protectorates, with boundaries approved in drawing rooms and diplomatic cables. A sense of bureaucratic confidence prevailed. Files were thick, reports were detailed, railways had been laid, flags raised, taxes collected. But the quiet presumptions of this order that Africa could be ruled efficiently, profitably, and indefinitely were about to be tested in ways no administrator had predicted. The first disruption came in 1914, with the outbreak of the First World War. The war in Europe would ripple across Africa's colonies, shattering illusions of control, exposing administrative weaknesses, and planting seeds of unrest that no file system could contain. Germany, which held colonies in German East Africa, Tanganyika, Cameroon, Togo, and Southwest Africa, was suddenly an enemy of Britain, France, and Belgium. These European conflicts spilled into the colonies, often in ways their architects had not fully anticipated. In German East Africa, a brilliant and unpredictable officer named General Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck led a small but effective guerrilla campaign against British forces. His troops, including thousands of African askaris, eluded capture for 4 years, drawing colonial resources into a war of pursuit through dense jungle and unforgiving terrain. The British, French, and Belgian administrations conscripted hundreds of thousands of African porters to support their campaigns. These men, mostly unpaid, carried munitions, food, and equipment across vast distances. Disease, hunger, and exhaustion claimed many. Their names were not recorded in London or Paris. Their labor went largely unacknowledged. The war disrupted supply chains, emptied treasuries, and strained the fragile systems that had been built during the first decades of colonial rule. Post-war, many African colonies emerged poorer, more indebted, and more restive. Germany's defeat in 1918 led to the seizure of its colonies, redistributed as League of Nations mandates. Britain gained Tanganyika and parts of Cameroon. France received Togo and the rest of Cameroon. Belgium formally annexed Rwanda-Urundi, modern Rwanda and Burundi. These territories were now administered under the pretense of trusteeship. The League of Nations mandated that colonial powers prepare native peoples for self-rule. But in reality, little changed. The files were relabeled, the flags replaced, the systems remained. Back in Africa, the 1920s and 1930s saw the rise of new forms of resistance, quieter, smarter, and increasingly political. Across the continent, Africans who had served in the war as soldiers or porters returned with stories, experiences, and new ideas. Many had been exposed to European ideals of liberty, justice, and representation, even if they had never experienced them firsthand. Some began to organize through churches, labor unions, and educational associations. In Nigeria, a new middle class of educated elites, many trained in mission schools or abroad, began to question colonial policies. Leaders like Herbert Macaulay criticized British taxation and land seizures. Newspapers published editorials in English and native languages. Societies were formed to preserve local traditions and push back against assimilation. In British-ruled Kenya, Kikuyu land was increasingly encroached upon by white settlers. The British introduced policies limiting African access to land in the White Highlands, setting the stage for deeper tensions that would erupt in later decades. Yet colonial administrations responded with familiar tools: commissions, censuses, court systems, and school curricula designed to contain dissent, not to encourage debate. They believed in gradual progress, but only on their terms. Africans could be educated but not politically empowered. Chiefs could be respected, but only if loyal. Labor could be organized but not unionized. Still, the bureaucratic systems grew. By the 1930s, colonial offices were producing more paperwork than ever. District officers recorded rainfall, rice yields, vaccination numbers, court cases, and school attendance. Colonial capitals like Lagos, Nairobi, Dakar, and Accra were filled with clerks, interpreters, surveyors, and messengers. To the outside world, the African colonies looked stable, but the files often hid friction. Beneath the charts and schedules, people were being displaced, traditions rewritten, and identities fragmented. The borders drawn in 1885 had hardened into real political cages. Cross-border trade was restricted. Ethnic groups were divided. Migrants became trespassers in lands they had long considered home. In French West Africa, the policy of assimilation began to falter. Despite promises of equality, most Africans remained subjects, not citizens. Resistance movements like the Negritude literary movement, led by writers such as Leopold Sédar Senghor, emerged to challenge French cultural dominance and reclaim African identity. In Belgian Congo, reforms were minimal. The colony remained one of the most tightly controlled, with every level of society monitored by a dense network of officials and Catholic missionaries. Education was rudimentary, focused on religious obedience and manual labor. The idea of Congolese self-rule was unthinkable to administrators in Brussels. Even indirect rule, long championed by the British, began to show cracks. Many warrant chiefs were deeply unpopular, seen as collaborators. In places like Nigeria, popular protests erupted against taxes and chiefs alike, most famously in the 1929 Aba Women's War, in which thousands of Igbo women organized against colonial taxation and injustice. Though labeled a riot by British records, it was one of the earliest mass anti-colonial protests in West Africa. Throughout the interwar years, colonial governments attempted reforms not out of benevolence, but in response to growing resistance and economic difficulty. The Great Depression of the 1930s slashed export prices, decimated colonial revenues, and triggered further hardship in African economies that had been forcibly tied to single-crop exports. In Uganda, cotton farmers struggled. In Ghana, cocoa prices collapsed. In Algeria, wheat farmers went bankrupt. People lost land, laborers lost work, hunger increased. But the systems remained rigid. The files still needed to be filled. The revenue offices still needed quotas. The court cases still needed decisions. By the end of the 1930s, colonial rule in Africa appeared intact, but it was increasingly hollow. The scramble for Africa had succeeded in dividing the continent, but it had failed to build a shared political or economic vision. The borders remained straight, awkward, and deeply artificial, but within them, the people were beginning to move. The Second World War would accelerate this movement. Africans would be conscripted again. Resources would be extracted again. And when peace returned, so too would a new generation of leaders no longer content with indirect representation or paternalistic oversight. The colonial states, built with clerks and confidence, would find themselves negotiating with the very subjects they had once ignored. But that is another chapter. For now, as the ink dries on another annual report, one must ask, what happens when the world inside the file no longer matches the world outside it? Story 5, The Siege of Delhi, Dust, Drought, and Daily Rations. By the summer of 1857, the dusty plains of northern India were heavy with tension. Heat clung to the sandstone walls. Crops withered. Letters arrived late. And in the city of Delhi, then an aging shadow of its Mughal glory, whispers of rebellion became footsteps, and those footsteps became a siege. Yet the siege of Delhi was not just a military campaign. It was also a logistical catastrophe, a daily struggle for survival, and a moment where the bureaucratic empire of the British East India Company collided with the raw reality of mass revolt. The events leading to this siege began far beyond Delhi's walls. In Meerut, just 40 miles away, a group of sepoys, Indian soldiers in the company's army, rebelled. Their discontent had been building for years, fueled by discriminatory policies, poor pay, and the increasing interference of the British in cultural and religious practices. The final spark, as often retold, was the introduction of the new Enfield rifle, whose cartridges were rumored to be greased with cow and pig fat, offensive to both Hindus and Muslims. When a group of sepoys refused the cartridges and were imprisoned, their comrades revolted, freed them, and killed several British officers and civilians. But what began as a localized mutiny soon spread. The rebels marched toward Delhi, a city still regarded by many Indians as the symbolic heart of sovereignty. Though the Mughal Empire had long since collapsed as a political force, its emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, still resided in the Red Fort, a figurehead steeped in faded legitimacy. The sepoys proclaimed him the ruler of Hindustan, an act that gave their rebellion a face, a name, and an axis. British control of Delhi collapsed quickly. The East India Company's officials fled or were killed. The Red Fort once again became a court, if only in name, and the rebels set up a provisional regime with a mixture of former Mughal officers and local leaders. For the British, the fall of Delhi was both a shock and a crisis. Delhi, though not a strategic military hub at that moment, was a symbolic capital. Losing it meant more than losing a garrison, it meant losing the narrative. So a force was dispatched from Ambala and Meerut under General Archdale Wilson, later joined by troops under John Nicholson, a bold and controversial figure known for his unwavering severity. Their task was straightforward in concept but difficult in execution: retake Delhi. And so began the siege process, far less dramatic than history books sometimes make it seem. The British and loyal Indian troops, numbering around 10,000, set up camp on the Delhi Ridge, a narrow, elevated line of land north of the city. It offered a view of the city walls but little else. The summer heat was merciless. Water was scarce. Disease was constant. Supplies came slowly from the rear, often delayed by rebel raids or broken wagons. Officers wrote daily reports: troop movements, deaths by sunstroke, shortages of ammunition. These documents, neatly copied and dispatched, tell of a campaign conducted more through patience than glory. Meanwhile, inside Delhi, things were not better. The rebels, though passionate, were poorly organized. Their commanders disagreed. Supplies dwindled. The city's population had swelled with refugees and fighters, putting pressure on already limited resources. Food prices soared. Sanitation collapsed. Tempers flared. The Mughal court tried to reassert authority, issuing proclamations and attempting to govern, but it was largely ceremonial. Bahadur Shah Zafar was in his 80s, reluctant and uncertain. The rebels had given him a throne he had no means to defend. As the siege dragged into its second month, the two sides settled into an exhausting stalemate. The British lacked the numbers to storm the city. The rebels lacked the cohesion to break the siege. The daily rhythm became one of sniping, skirmishes, heat, and illness. For the rank-and-file soldiers, both Indian and British, life on the ridge meant monotony and misery. Tents were pitched in dust. Meals were simple dal, biscuits, sometimes half rations of beef or mutton. Medical tents overflowed with patients suffering from cholera, heat exhaustion, and infected wounds. Letters home, if written at all, were grim. One sepoy, fighting on the British side, noted in a letter, "The sun kills more than the enemy. There is no end to it. The ground burns through the boots. We sleep in sweat." Supplies arrived by bullock cart, camel train, or were carried by hand. These lines were always vulnerable. Rebel bands launched attacks on baggage trains, cut off water carriers, and blocked roads. Officers recorded these actions in reports labeled petty disruption, but the impact was not petty at all. Every missed delivery meant more hunger, more thirst, more death. At night, the rebels fired rockets and musket shots at the ridge. During the day, British engineers inched forward with trenches and gun batteries, attempting to weaken the city's massive walls, particularly the Kashmiri Gate, a target identified early on for a potential breach. The engineers drew maps, calculated angles, and placed charges, often under cover of darkness or behind temporary walls of sandbags. It was slow work. In the meantime, the siege wore on. The situation inside Delhi continued to unravel. The bazaar economy collapsed. There was looting, then famine. Some rebel soldiers deserted. Others turned on civilians suspected of British sympathy. The Mughal court issued edicts condemning theft and chaos, but it had no police force, no judiciary. Authority existed on paper, not in the street. Even among the rebels, morale eroded. The dream of a restored empire faded under the weight of daily logistics. Too few bullets, too little food, too many factions. By early September, after over 3 months, British forces received critical reinforcements including heavy artillery. Plans were finalized for a direct assault on Delhi. But in this moment of imminent conflict, one cannot help but reflect on the months that preceded it. A siege remembered in textbooks as a turning point in Indian history, yet lived, day to day, as a test of survival and endurance. For those on both sides of the walls, the battle for Delhi was less about ideals and more about dust, thirst, and the dull ache of waiting. And one must wonder, when empires are made to confront the chaos they create, can order ever be restored without first burning through the old illusions? By early September 1857, the mood along the Delhi Ridge was shifting. 3 months of grinding siege had produced no decisive result. The heat had broken, but disease still lingered, and British officers, hardened by experience, understood that morale could not survive indefinitely in a trench. Nor could supplies. Ammunition was running low. Horses were dying. The wounded filled makeshift hospitals. Commanders knew what the reports did not say plainly. If Delhi was not retaken soon, it might not be retaken at all. And so, attention turned to planning the final assault. The engineers, who had labored through August to bring forward siege batteries, now had their work cut out. The city's massive stone walls, some as thick as 12 feet, were formidable. But repeated bombardment had begun to show results. A visible breach had formed near the Kashmiri Gate, and cracks had appeared along bastions to the north and northeast. The decision was made. The attack would begin at dawn on September 14, 1857. 5 columns of troops were assigned. Each had a specific objective, some to storm the breaches, others to clear buildings, advance down tight lanes, and ultimately take control of Chandni Chowk, the wide central avenue. The Red Fort and the Jama Masjid would follow. The assault plan, drafted by General Archdale Wilson and his staff, was methodical. Every movement was charted, every street assigned. Officers were briefed, signals were clarified. But even the most bureaucratically perfect plan rarely survives contact with a real city. Delhi, though old, was alive. Its streets twisted unpredictably. Walls that looked crumbling on a map stood firm in person. Gates meant to be unguarded had pickets, and the rebels, disorganized as they were, still fought with desperation. They knew the assault meant more than just military defeat. For many, it meant execution. The attack began with thunder. British and loyal Indian forces surged forward under the cover of pre-dawn cannon fire. At the Kashmiri Gate, a team of sappers and engineers, including men from the Bengal Engineers, placed explosive charges. 2 were killed before they could light the fuses. Another succeeded. The blast opened a ragged hole, and infantry poured through. Inside, however, they encountered immediate confusion. The rebels had set up makeshift barricades. Musket fire poured from windows. Grenades, homemade, crude, but deadly, rained down from rooftops. The narrowness of Delhi's lanes made coordinated movement nearly impossible. The carefully drawn plans fell away in the dust and noise. Lieutenants were forced to make minute-by-minute decisions, often contradicting the plan. Units became separated. Maps proved useless. Some regiments pushed too far and were isolated. Others failed to move at all. Worse still, the British suffered from a failure in supply coordination. Ammunition meant for the advance was stuck behind mule carts and wounded soldiers. Water carriers, critical in the heat, could not find their assigned units. A detachment of Gurkhas, fighting valiantly, was left without support for hours. Though never called a logistical disaster in the official records, memos written later that month hinted at the scale of miscommunication. And yet, street by street, Delhi began to fall. Rebel lines broke. Some fell back toward the Red Fort, others scattered. In Chandni Chowk, fierce fighting took place over 2 days. The narrow alleyways, once vibrant with markets and merchants, became charnel lanes of blood and rubble. Snipers fired from minarets. Rebels, trapped in mosques or homes, refused to surrender. By September 20, the Red Fort was surrounded. Bahadur Shah Zafar, elderly and shaken, had taken shelter in the Humayun's tomb, a centuries-old mausoleum on the city's outskirts. There, he was captured with little resistance. Delhi, for all practical purposes, was now under British control. But control did not mean peace. The city, once home to hundreds of thousands, had been emptied by siege, starvation, and fear. The British response was swift and brutal. Suspected rebels were summarily executed. Entire neighborhoods were burned. Civilian homes were looted by soldiers, both British and Indian, under the loose pretense of searching for arms. Courts martial were set up. Trials were hasty. Punishments were public. Executions were often carried out by hanging or firing squad. Some rebels, particularly those believed to have attacked British civilians, were tied to cannon mouths and blown apart, a symbolic inversion of Mughal execution methods once used on mutineers. These acts, described in later reports as necessary measures, were also part of psychological warfare, a message to other rebellious regions. Meanwhile, a different kind of war continued in the files. Detailed lists of the dead were compiled. Inventories of recovered weapons, rebel identities, confiscated properties, and reliable citizens filled notebooks and ledgers. Officers scribbled down notes on alleyways, house numbers, door heights, creating a cartographic record of the city street by street. It was an attempt to make sense of the chaos, to reclaim Delhi not just with bayonets, but with bureaucracy. One particularly revealing document from the period was a ration ledger, kept by a junior officer tasked with feeding British troops stationed in the city post-siege. It details daily allocations of rice, dal, flour, and tea divided by regiment, adjusted for casualties. In the margins, notes appear: short by 48 pounds due to spoilage, or no issue today, cart lost. These minor scrawls reveal more about the true state of post-siege Delhi than most official dispatches. Outside the city walls, refugees tried to return. Some found their homes looted. Others were denied entry altogether, labeled potential threats. Villages nearby were warned against harboring fugitives, and the countryside, already suffering from drought, became a place of famine and quiet resistance. For the British, the capture of Delhi was both a victory and a lesson in limits. Yes, they had retaken the symbolic capital. Yes, they had broken the siege, but the costs were staggering. Thousands were dead. Infrastructure lay in ruins. The Mughal dynasty, already a ghost, was now officially extinguished. But the rebellion did not end with Delhi. Fighting continued in Kanpur, Lucknow, Jhansi, and other cities for months to come. The siege was only one chapter in what the British came to call the Indian Mutiny, and what others later called the First War of Independence. Still in London, the news of Delhi's recapture was met with relief. Newspaper readers learned of heroism under fire and the defense of empire. Medals were minted. Reports were sent to Parliament. Lessons were supposedly learned. But if you read the full file, the reports, the diaries, the requisition orders, you see something else. You see an empire forced to confront the real price of its assumptions. That loyalty could be maintained through routine, that tradition could be repressed by file, and that a city like Delhi could be understood through maps alone. Which leads us to ask, can any empire truly govern a place whose heartbeat it does not hear, whose streets it marches down, but never walks? The siege was over, but Delhi remained broken. Its streets, once crowded with merchants and processions, were quiet. Its gates, once symbolic of Mughal majesty, now served as checkpoints patrolled by riflemen. The city had changed hands, but what came next was not peace, it was paperwork. The British victory in September 1857 did not mark the end of conflict, but rather the beginning of a new administrative project, one that sought to redefine Delhi, not merely retake it. To begin, the British set about reorganizing the city's population. Thousands had fled during the siege, either expelled by rebels, driven out by hunger, or caught in the crossfire. When they returned, they found their neighborhoods razed, their homes occupied, or their names blacklisted. The British military administration created registries of returning residents, divided into loyalists, neutrals, and suspected rebels. This process, part policing, part record-keeping, aimed to prevent a resurgence of rebellion. It also created a class of informants, individuals who traded information about neighbors and rival families for protection or favor. Alongside this social sorting came the work of infrastructure and repair. Roads had to be cleared. Buildings had to be assessed for damage. Mosques and temples, many of which had been used as rebel strongholds, were inspected, and in some cases repurposed as barracks or warehouses. Military engineers led the reconstruction, but everything had to be accounted for. Ledgers tracked the use of brick, lime, timber, and nails. Requests for wheelbarrows or oxen were filed through requisition forms. The rebuilding was as much about asserting control as it was about restoring function. And then there was the issue of governance. The East India Company, already under scrutiny in London, was widely blamed for the outbreak of the rebellion. Its policies, officials claimed, had been too ambitious, too intrusive, and too dismissive of Indian traditions. In Delhi, these failures were especially clear. The company had governed through symbolic domination, stationing troops near the Red Fort and projecting strength through courtly rituals stripped of respect. Its officers saw themselves as administrators of civilization, but in doing so, they had eroded both traditional structures and community cohesion. So in November 1858, just over a year after the fall of Delhi, the East India Company was formally dissolved. The British Crown assumed direct rule over India. The Government of India Act 1858 marked a transition. A new viceroy replaced the company's governor-general. The Queen issued a proclamation of peace, promising equal treatment of Indians under the law, an end to land confiscations, and protection for religious practices. But in Delhi, these promises played out with uneven reality. The new civil administration was led by a cautious bureaucracy that feared another uprising. Every aspect of city life was monitored. Markets were regulated. Public gatherings were discouraged. Police patrols increased. Schools were reopened, but curricula were revised to emphasize loyalty, order, and English. Even the city's architecture became a form of control. Many Mughal-era buildings were demolished under the guise of modernization. New government offices were built in a neoclassical British style, designed to dominate the skyline and visually suppress older Indian aesthetics. The Red Fort, once the symbol of empire, was partially dismantled. Its inner courts were repurposed as barracks. And yet beneath these changes, Delhi's social fabric persisted. Merchants reopened their shops in Chandni Chowk. Artisans resumed their trades in narrow side streets. Religious festivals returned, cautiously at first, then more confidently. The memory of the siege faded into everyday necessity. People needed to eat, trade, worship, and survive. Still, the British kept detailed files. Every transaction, arrest, school attendance, and marriage registration was recorded. Colonial officers submitted weekly reports to the new viceroy. These documents, now archived in British and Indian libraries, speak in the language of measured confidence. The city is stable, rebellious activity suppressed, no disturbances of note. But Delhi's calm was deceptive. The trauma of 1857 had etched itself into family histories. Stories passed quietly from generation to generation of relatives hanged, homes lost, prayers interrupted by cannon fire. These were not preserved in ledgers, but in memory and mourning. Bahadur Shah Zafar, the last Mughal emperor, was exiled to Rangoon, where he died in 1862. His poetry, composed in the aftermath of the rebellion, reflected despair. Na kisi ki aankh ka noor hoon. Na kisi ki dil ka karar hoon. I am not the light of anyone's eye, nor the peace of anyone's heart. His grave was unmarked for decades, another symbol of a dynasty, and a world quietly erased. Meanwhile, the British focused on preventing another rebellion. They reorganized the Indian Army, reducing the number of Indian troops and increasing the ratio of British officers. Artillery, seen as a decisive tool during the siege, was kept firmly under British control. They also expanded the use of intelligence networks. Informants were recruited from within local communities. Spy reports were collected weekly. The cost of maintaining this system, both financial and moral, was high, but deemed necessary. In classrooms and courtrooms, British values were reinforced. English became the language of administration. Legal codes were rewritten. Indian traditions were tolerated, but only as long as they remained politically inert. The British believed they had learned the lessons of 1857, but their reforms were driven by fear, not understanding. They had suppressed the symptoms, not addressed the causes. And yet, in the quiet margins of this new order, resistance took different forms. Writers and poets mourned the lost Delhi of their childhoods. Teachers encouraged students to learn English, not for assimilation, but for power. Merchants formed associations to protect their interests. Minor civil servants began keeping copies of their own reports, aware that paper could be power. The city, once ruled by emperors and then by company clerks, became a place where survival meant navigating a new kind of empire, one of rules, records, and regulation. Delhi would rise again in the 20th century as a center of nationalist activity, a site of protest, and eventually the capital of independent India. But the siege of 1857 marked a turning point, not just because it ended the Mughal line, not just because it brought about crown rule, but because it revealed the limits of military might, the fragility of imperial certainty, and the dull but deadly power of bureaucracy. The files of Delhi's siege are filled with logistics, names, and orders. But between the lines lies something harder to archive, the sense that, for a few months in 1857, history itself paused on the city's ramparts, unsure which direction to turn. And it raises a question that echoes through the archives. When cities fall and rise again, is it the bullets or the balance sheets that shape their fate? Story 6. The Salt Tax, Ledgers, Levers, and Local Resistance. Long before it was a symbol of defiance in Gandhi's Salt March of 1930, salt had been a quiet but unrelenting pillar of British imperial control. Throughout the 19th century, it was not simply a seasoning or a preservative, it was a commodity, a currency, and for many, a curse. The British Raj did not invent the taxation of salt in India. Pre-colonial kingdoms had long regulated salt production, especially in coastal regions. But the East India Company, and later the British Crown, transformed this regulation into a massive revenue-generating machine, one that reached deep into village life, relied on detailed bureaucratic systems, and sparked more acts of resistance than many of the better-known battles of empire. To understand this system, one must begin not in Parliament, but in Orissa and the salt pans of the Rann of Kutch, sun-baked expanses where families, often from hereditary salt-making castes, produced salt by evaporating seawater in shallow pans. This was backbreaking work. The salt harvesters stood for hours in the brine under blistering skis, turning the salt with wooden rakes and gathering it into small white hills. But the salt they harvested was not theirs to keep. By the 1830s, British policy had evolved to centralize and monopolize salt production and distribution. Independent salt producers were either prohibited, taxed beyond profitability, or absorbed into the company's supply chain. Even the right to make salt for personal use, something that had been a generational custom, became a matter of permit and penalty. The heart of this control was the Salt Department, a sprawling bureaucratic body with branches across Bengal, Bombay, Madras, and the northwestern provinces. This department was responsible for overseeing the production, transport, pricing, and taxation of salt, and its files are among the most detailed colonial records available. Each salt-producing district kept logbooks documenting daily output. Inspectors, often junior British officers or Indian subordinates, visited sites regularly, noting labor conditions, pan sizes, evaporation rates, and signs of unauthorized harvesting. These reports were copied, indexed, and forwarded up the chain to the provincial commissioners. Salt depots were guarded like military garrisons. Warehouses in cities like Allahabad, Calcutta, and Madras stored enormous mounds of crystal salt, which were then weighed, marked, and released only with the appropriate stamped permits. Transport was tightly regulated. Bullock carts carrying salt were stopped at Chowkis checkpoints placed along roads and rivers. If the paperwork didn't match the cargo, the salt was confiscated and the cart driver fined, or worse. Some carts were turned back for minor infractions, incorrect seals, expired permits, or improper route deviations. But the most emblematic feature of this system was not the salt depots or the permits. It was the salt line, a literal wall of bureaucracy and bricks that ran over 2,500 miles across India. Officially known as the Inland Customs Line, this barrier stretched from the foot of the Himalayas in Punjab all the way to Orissa's Bay of Bengal coast. At its peak, the salt line was manned by over 12,000 customs officers and included checkpoints, watchtowers, fences, and thorn hedges. It was meant to prevent untaxed salt from entering the taxed regions. Much of the barrier was composed of dense hedges of thorny bushes, grown and maintained over years by paid cultivators. These hedges were planted in rows, trimmed and reinforced with bamboo fencing. In regions where the hedge failed due to floods, fires, or grazing animals, brick walls and moats were added. Travelers crossing the line had to submit to inspection. Traders had to show stamped passes. Women carrying salt in their skirts were searched. Children with satchels were questioned. It was a system of pervasive suspicion, one where salt, one of the most basic necessities of life, became a vector of control. But why salt? Because it was unavoidable. In tropical climates with high rates of perspiration and basic diets, salt was not a luxury. It was essential for hydration, for health, and for the preservation of food. Every household, from the poorest laborer to the wealthiest landlord, needed it. And by taxing it, the British ensured a steady stream of income, one that could not be avoided even by the most frugal citizen. For a family in Bengal in the 1850s, the monthly cost of salt could exceed the cost of grain. And yet, because of regulation, they could not simply gather salt from the local marsh or riverbank. Doing so invited a fine or jail sentence. Records from the Salt Department show countless entries like this. On the 12th of July, 1856, apprehended one Lal Bahadur for collecting brine residue near Puri coast. Quantity seized, 3 pounds. Fine imposed, 3 rupees. Subject released with warning. 3 rupees, for a daily laborer, could represent a week's wages. The injustice of the salt system bred quiet acts of defiance. Smuggling became a cottage industry. Women concealed salt in cooking pots. Children carried satchels of contraband under blankets. Small-scale salt peddlers traveled by night, using side paths and village trails. In some areas, entire communities engaged in illicit salt production, relying on lookouts and bribes to keep officials away. But the British were aware and prepared. Maps of salt smuggling hotspots were drawn. Special patrol units were trained to intercept smugglers. Rewards were offered for informants. And like so much of colonial governance, this process produced a mountain of paperwork, reports, receipts, warnings, prosecutions. And it was all, ironically, deeply inefficient. Despite the massive expense of maintaining the salt line and the salaries of its thousands of officers, smuggling continued. In some years, over 20% of salt consumed in inland provinces was estimated to be illegal. But efficiency was not the only goal, control was. The British knew the salt tax hit the poorest the hardest, but that too was the point. By forcing even the most marginal members of society to participate in the empire's economic structure by making them buy, register, pay, and conform, they embedded the empire into daily life in a way that was difficult to escape. Which raises a question, still unanswered in the ledgers. How many empires thrive not on conquest, but on the quiet power of necessity? To the untrained eye, the inland customs line may have seemed like little more than a hedge, a ragged barrier of thorns, briars, and bamboo, broken up by the occasional sentry post. But to those who lived near it, served along it, or tried to cross it, the hedge was a border, a burden, and a bureaucracy all rolled into one. Stretching across multiple provinces, the salt line became, by the mid-19th century, one of the most elaborate customs enforcement systems in the world. It was the literal manifestation of empire's desire to control movement not of armies or ideas, but of salt. And with it came all the tedious but consequential details of governance, rotas, ledgers, shift schedules, and inspection protocols. The backbone of the salt line was its customs officers, known in some regions as chowkidars, jamadars, or watchmen. These men were recruited locally but trained under British supervision. Many were ex-soldiers or landless laborers, selected not for education or literacy, but for endurance and obedience. Each man was assigned a section of the line, typically a few miles long, which he was expected to patrol regularly. Watchtowers, raised wooden or stone platforms, were constructed every few kilometers to give a vantage point across the countryside. These were humble affairs, no more than a stool, a canvas canopy, and perhaps a water pot, yet they were seen as critical posts in the war against smuggling. Reports from salt commissioners detail the rhythms of this system. A watchman was to rise before dawn, inspect his assigned hedge section, walk the perimeter, record any signs of disturbance, report to his local supervisor at midday, return to patrol until nightfall. Every deviation from this schedule required a written explanation, often dictated to a literate subordinate. A common note: Watchman Ram Lal absent from post between 2-4 p.m. on account of stomach ailment. No smuggling observed during absence. And yet smuggling persisted quietly, cleverly, and constantly. Villagers on both sides of the line found ways to bypass the checkpoints. Children carried small cloth pouches filled with salt concealed beneath bundles of firewood. Elderly women wrapped salt crystals in sari hymns. At night, smugglers crept through gaps in the hedge, using moonlight and memory to trace forgotten paths through brush and dry stream beds. To counter this, British administrators instituted rewards and fines for customs officers. If a smuggler was caught and a fine collected, a portion of the proceeds was paid to the captor. But if salt was discovered in a district without an official report, the officer in charge was docked a portion of his wages. This created a predictable outcome. Petty corruption flourished. Some officers turned blind eyes for small bribes. Others staged false arrests to claim the reward. There are entries in Salt Department reports that read in part: Salt seizure reported in District 7. Accused, Punna, a widow. Fine levied 2 rupees. Officer Mahadev Singh awarded bonus. Discrepancies noted in repeat seizures from same household. Such reports appear regularly, hinting at an uneven enforcement that punished the poor more than the clever. Beyond the petty enforcement lay the tedium of central management. Salt commissioners were appointed for each major province, with monthly responsibilities that included auditing transport ledgers, reviewing permit approvals, calculating loss through spoilage or theft, inspecting hedge quality, submitting reports to the Revenue Board. These were not glamorous jobs. The correspondence between salt commissioners and district collectors is filled with appeals for more staff, better transport, and higher wages, often met with curt refusals from Calcutta or London. One commissioner wrote, "The hedge between Etawah and Allahabad is in dire condition. Thorn bushes have withered from excessive grazing. Replacement saplings are delayed due to cart shortage. I request urgent funds." The reply: "Your request has been noted. No funds available this quarter. Maintain current patrol frequency." And yet, for all its flaws, the salt line endured. By the 1860s, the hedge stretched over 2,500 miles and cost nearly 1.5 million rupees annually to maintain, more than the cost of most provincial police forces. But it brought in over 6 million rupees annually in salt revenue, and that, in the eyes of the empire, made it worthwhile. The hedge itself became something of a legend. Travelers from Britain wrote of it with curiosity. One civil servant described it as a strange garden of imperial necessity. Others, more critical, called it a wall of weeds to keep out hunger's cheapest cure. Despite its formidable reach, the line was not impenetrable. Monsoon rains regularly washed out sections of the hedge. Insects devoured the roots. Fires, often accidental, sometimes intentional, burned entire miles of the barrier in a single night. Each breach triggered a paper storm. Field officers submitted emergency notices. Hedge cultivators were summoned. Supply carts were dispatched. New thorns were planted, sometimes too early, resulting in wasted saplings and swollen budgets. Salt Department memos show that upkeep of the hedge itself, consumed almost as much attention as enforcement. And yet the machinery of monotony rolled on. Permits were stamped, routes were inspected, cart drivers filed trip reports, offenses were logged, appeals were dismissed. But outside the ledger columns, another record was being kept: the memory of injustice. In village after village, salt became not just a foodstuff, but a symbol, not of rebellion in the traditional sense, but of unjust intrusion. Elders told stories of children jailed for carrying salted peanuts. Women sang songs mocking the salt officers. Merchants found ways to measure seasoning without ever naming it as salt. The British saw this as compliance, but it was not. It was endurance. A quiet, often unseen resistance that did not come with guns or banners, but with empty cooking pots, whispered warnings, and the daily decision to walk a little further, wait a little longer, or eat with a little less. In the archives, you find the records of empire. In the villages, you find its cost. And so we ask, can a hedge ever hold back the tide of a people's memory? By the close of the 19th century, the salt tax had become one of the most widely resented features of British rule in India. It was omnipresent, it was unavoidable, and worst of all, it was accepted as normal, like dust or drought. For nearly a century, Indians had lived within a system where the right to season your food required permission. Salt was weighed, taxed, and watched. The inland customs line still stretched for thousands of miles, though its hedge had long since been replaced by brick posts, stone watchtowers, and checkpoint buildings. Patrols still stopped carts, officers still filled out forms. But beyond the hedge, the empire was changing. The late 1800s saw the rise of new ideas. Railways now crossed the subcontinent, spreading not only goods but news. Pamphlets moved faster than salt carts. Political societies began to form, first in university towns and princely states, then in cities like Bombay, Calcutta, and Madras. By 1882, the Indian National Congress had been founded. At first, it was a forum for elites, lawyers, journalists, professors to petition the British for reform. Their demands were moderate: more Indian representation, fairer laws, improved education. But over time, their language hardened. And always, the salt tax remained a sore point. In speeches, it became a shorthand for injustice, a simple example that could be understood in every kitchen and village. Even illiterate farmers, unfamiliar with parliament or policy, understood the absurdity of being punished for boiling seawater. In 1878, under Viceroy Lord Lytton, the salt tax was increased yet again, a move widely condemned even in British newspapers. Critics noted that it affected the poor disproportionately, and its enforcement was wasteful and cruel. Some Liberal MPs in London called for its repeal. Instead, what came was more regulation. Inland customs duties were merged with salt taxes to create a unified system. The salt department grew larger. New forms were introduced. It was, as ever, a matter of paperwork over people. But the resentment simmered. And then, in the early 20th century, a man named Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi began to speak about salt. To most British administrators, Gandhi at first seemed harmless, a soft-spoken lawyer with peculiar dress and a passion for peaceful protest. But Gandhi understood something crucial. Symbols matter, especially when they speak to daily suffering. Salt, he realized, was more than a policy. It was a pressure point. It was an injustice people could feel on their tongues. And so in 1930, he launched the Salt March, or, as it came to be known, the Dandi March. Over 24 days, Gandhi and a small band of followers walked 240 miles from Sabarmati Ashram to the coastal village of Dandi in Gujarat. Along the way, thousands joined. They walked in silence. They slept in village fields. They drew crowds who offered food, water, and prayers. The British dismissed it as theater. But on April 6, 1930, Gandhi stepped into the surf at Dandi, scooped a handful of wet sand and let it dry. By doing so and later boiling it to extract illegal salt, he broke the law. Quietly, deliberately. And the world noticed. Within weeks, protests erupted across India. People began making salt in towns and villages. Women stirred brine in cooking pots. Children collected dried sea foam. The salt department issued thousands of warrants. Jails overflowed. But the power had shifted. The tax had been law for over 100 years, and yet its undoing began with a handful of sand. What followed was not an immediate repeal. The British, stubborn and embarrassed, held firm. Gandhi was arrested. Demonstrators were beaten. The press was censored. But the moral argument had been lost. Images of police striking unarmed protesters were printed in foreign newspapers. Letters poured into British offices. Even in Parliament, defenders of empire found themselves faltering. One MP famously asked, "Can we truly defend a system where a child may be jailed for seasoning his dinner?" The answer, of course, was no. The salt tax was eventually reduced and restructured. The inland customs line was formally dismantled by 1879, though checkpoints lingered in some regions into the 20th century. But it took until 1946, just a year before Indian independence, for the tax to be fully abolished. And yet the real victory lay not in repeal, but in what salt came to represent. It was not just about brine or borders. It was about the right to live without fear of paperwork, the right to labor without being penalized, and the right to season your food without the state in your kitchen. Salt had shown that even the most mundane objects, even something as overlooked as a grain of seasoning, could carry the weight of empire. And in its resistance, India had demonstrated the quiet power of daily life. The Salt March became one of the defining images of the independence movement. Gandhi's simple act of picking up salt remains etched in historical memory, not as rebellion, but as reclamation. It prompts a reflection. What other silent burdens do we carry, disguised as normal? And when we finally lay them down, will we recognize their true weight?